There's a version of this film that feels safe, a comforting story about passion, poetry, and finding your voice. That version is easy to love, but it's also incomplete, because underneath the warmth, there's a colder question being asked one. Most viewers never sit with long enough to feel. This is a drama, but it behaves like a pressure chamber. Nothing explodes at first. Everything tightens. The experience you get from staying with this story isn't motivation. It's recognition. Recognition of how fragile identity becomes when it's shaped by approval, fear, and expectation. And why awakening someone inside a rigid system doesn't always set them free. Sometimes it simply exposes them. The setting looks calm. A prestigious boarding school, old stone buildings. Traditions polished smooth by time. Discipline here isn't loud. It's inherited. Rules don't need to be explained because everyone already knows them. Excellence, honor, success, these words aren't goals. They're commandments. And into this controlled world arrive a group of boys at the age where the mind starts to stretch faster than permission allows. Each of them enters with a role already written. One is expected to succeed effortlessly. Another is expected to obey. One hides behind humor. One hides behind silence. They are not asked who they are. They are told who they will become. That's important. Because the story isn't about changing the system. It's about what happens when the system briefly loosens its grip hand, then tightens again. The teacher who arrives doesn't announce himself as a disruptor. He doesn't shout. He doesn't attack tradition directly. Instead, he introduces uncertainty. He asks the students to look differently, to question how meaning is assigned, to consider that greatness might not come from following the path perfectly, but from choosing it consciously. Psychologically, this is the most dangerous kind of influence, not because it's radical, but because it's subtle. He doesn't give them answers. He gives them permission, and permission, for young minds raised on certainty, is intoxicating. At first, the boys treat this new way of thinking like a secret language, something private, something safe, because it feels intellectual. They're not rebelling. They're exploring. They tell themselves they can step back anytime, but curiosity doesn't stay contained. One student in particular feels this permission more intensely than the others. He's bright, imaginative, eager to be seen but starved of approval at home. His confidence looks natural, but it's actually borrowed. It depends entirely on whether someone else believes in him. That distinction matters, because when encouragement fills a void instead of reinforcing a foundation, it doesn't strengthen the self, it replaces Italiano. The boys resurrect an old tradition, meeting in secrecy, reading poetry, sharing thoughts they've never spoken out loud. On the surface, it's harmless, even beautiful. But psychologically, something deeper is happening. They are experimenting with identity without consequences, at least. That's what they think. In reality, they're creating a second self, one that only exists away from authority. This is where the tension quietly builds. The school doesn't react immediately. Institutions rarely do. They wait. They observe. Control systems are patient. And while the boys feel like they're expanding, the structure around them is simply gathering information. What makes this story unsettling isn't that the students are inspired. It's that they misunderstand what inspiration can and cannot protect them from. One boy believes talent will justify desire. Another believes silence will keep him safe. Another believes obedience can coexist with private freedom. Each belief feels reasonable. Each belief is incomplete. The teacher never tells them to defy their parents. He never instructs them to challenge authority directly, but by teaching them to value their inner voice, he introduces a conflict the system cannot tolerate. Because the system doesn't punish creativity. It punishes unpredictability. As pressure from outside expectations grows, the boys respond differently. Some retreat. Some compromise. Some double down. This is not because they are braver or weaker. It's because of how much approval they need to survive. The most vulnerable among them isn't the loudest. It's the one whose sense of worth depends on being allowed to exist as he is. When he finally steps into what he wants, it feels like freedom. But freedom without protection is exposure. And this is where the film begins to feel different from how it's remembered. The adults aren't portrayed as villains. They don't see themselves as cruel. They believe they are preserving order, and from their perspective, they are correcting a deviation before it spreads. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. No one thinks they're destroying a life. They think they're fixing a problem. As consequences begin to surface, the students look for someone to blame. Responsibility becomes a moving target. Was it the tradition, the teacher, the choices they made, or the environment that allowed none of those choices to exist safely? The film refuses to answer that directly. Instead, it shows how quickly ideals collapse when survival is threatened. Watch how loyalty changes. Watch how silence becomes strategy. Watch how courage looks different when the cost becomes real. This isn't a story about standing up on desks. It's a story about what happens before and after that moment. About how easy it is to celebrate individuality and how rare it is to protect it. By the time authority demands clarity, the boys have already learned something irreversible. They can see the gap between who they are and who they re-expected to be. And that knowledge doesn't disappear just because someone orders it to. But knowledge alone doesn't guarantee strength. Sometimes, it just makes the fall hurt more. The quiet question the film keeps asking is this: if you teach someone to think freely inside a system that cannot tolerate freedom, who carries the responsibility when the system reacts? The answer isn't simple, and the film never lets it be. It just keeps tightening the space between belief and consequence, and waits. And waits.